If you've ever wondered what this strange looking graph is on the back of your camera, this is a histogram, and a histogram can actually be very important. So in this video, I'm going to show you what a histogram is, what it's showing us, and most importantly, how we can use it to take better photos. So I hope you'll stick around. Hi, Paul here from Photo Genius. Welcome to my channel where I do photography tutorials like this one. I share tips and tricks, and occasionally I do gear reviews as well. So if you're new here, please consider subscribing. This video is all about histograms for beginners, and I've got 5 goals that I want to achieve in this video. Goal number 1 is to show you how to view the histogram, explain to you what it is, how we can use it to improve our photography, show you how to view the live histogram, and finally going to talk about a technique called exposing to the right. Okay, no time to waste. First thing I want to do is show you how to view the histogram on your digital camera. Viewing the histogram is usually pretty straightforward. If you've got a Fujifilm camera, you press playback and then the display button. Most of the entry-level Canon cameras also have a display button, so same again, press playback, display, you may have to press it a couple of times, up comes the histogram. If your Canon camera doesn't have a display button, it's going to have an info button. So this is a Canon 80D, press playback, info, once, twice, there's the histogram. Nikon is where it gets interesting, because with most Nikon entry-level cameras, you cannot view the histogram until you've set this up. So it's not a factory setting. So for you Nikon users, I'm going to show you how to set this up. It won't take a moment. So here we have a Nikon camera. We can view our images, but not our histograms. So let's fix this by pressing the menu. From the menu options, let's go to the playback menu, then select playback display options. And from the options available, let's skip RGB histogram and go to overview. Select this one, press OK. And now all we need to do is press playback, and using the multi-selector tool, you can press up or down to view the overview page. Now the overview page shows you not just the camera settings, but also the histogram, and you're done. So now we know how to view the histogram, let's take a look at what it is and what it's showing us. A histogram is basically a chart. It's a graphical representation of the tonal range, or the range of tones that your camera has captured and recorded when you took a picture. So let's take a look at a histogram and break it down into sections. We're going to start by moving over to the far left of the histogram. This is where the blacks are. So this is the very darkest part of your image. If we move over to the right, this is where your shadow detail will be found. In the middle, not surprisingly, are the midtones. Over to the right of the midtones are the highlights. These are the brighter parts of your image. And over to the right is white. These are where the whites are. So this is the complete extreme of the black side of the histogram. Now, if you're a Lightroom user, you can open up an image in Lightroom, hover over the histogram, and you can see it clearly broken down into sections. So let's take a look at an image. This image taken in Guildford in the UK, and this is a pretty reasonable exposure. If we bring the histogram up, this will show us the tones that we've captured. Now if we look at the histogram and we start by looking over to the left, we see quite a lot of peaking going on. So there's a lot of data over there, which means we've got a lot of shadow detail going on. And this is going to be the dark areas here in the bushes and the trees, this dark tree over here. That's all the shadow detail. In terms of midtones, there's a big peaking over here, which is yellow, and that's going to be the grey areas in the sky and probably the castle itself. Over to the right, we've got a massive peak here, which is the sky. This is the brighter part of the image, so we've got lots of sky detail going on, and lucky for us there's no peaking over to the right, otherwise the image will be overexposed. Now if we move on to the next picture, this is clearly an underexposed image, and of course the histogram now reflects that. You will see that all the data, all the peaks have now moved over or shifted to the left. So we've got a lot of peaking going on the left, and it is actually touching the edge of the histogram. So that means that parts of our image are absolute black, which generally is not ideal. That's this area along here. There is some midtones going on. This is going to be representing the sky, and there's no peaking or anything over to the right. So there's no real highlight detail in this image. Now if we move on to the next one, again clearly overexposed, everything will shift over to the right because now we've captured more brighter tones. So straight away over to the right here we see a massive peak. Again, it's touching the right of the histogram. That means that some of the parts of this image are so overexposed they literally are white, and that of course is the sky. The midtones have dropped considerably, but that's generally this area here, and the shadow detail, again there is some shadow detail there, but it's dropped quite a lot. So clearly with our own eyes we can see when an image is over or underexposed, but the histogram is good because it shows us to what extent that has occurred. We generally don't want any peeking over to the right or over to the far left. So what does a perfect histogram look like? Well, in a moment I'm going to show you. Before that, I want to tell you about Skillshare, who have kindly sponsored this video. If, like myself, you love creating, take a moment to check out what Skillshare has to offer, because there has never been a better time to learn new skills. And Skillshare is an online learning community for creatives with thousands of inspiring classes covering topics that include illustration, design, music, video, and of course, photography. So this week I've been watching some great tutorials and picked up some really cool tips on cinematography and filmmaking from Zach Mulligan. And you can too, because for a limited time you can use the link in the description below this video to get a free trial of Skillshare premium membership and take your creativity to the next level. So many thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring this video and supporting my channel. So what is the perfect histogram? Well, some say the perfect histogram should look a bit like a mountain or a hill, so it should have lots of peaking in the middle, and then the graph should tail off down to the edges. Now I went through my images earlier today. This image I selected, I took this a few weeks ago here in Brisbane, and if I bring up the histogram, you'll see that it almost fits the description of the perfect histogram. It looks a bit like a mountain or a hill. There's lots of peaking in the middle, which is the midtones. I've got some shadow detail. I've got some highlight detail. Now there is a bit of a peak over here to the far right, which means that technically I have slightly overexposed the image. And if we bring the image back, this will be the sun rays coming through the top of the frame here. So nothing to really be too worried about. So that is pretty much the perfect histogram. So what if you take an image and your histogram looks nothing like this? Does it mean you've stuffed up? Well, not necessarily. Let's take a look at another image and I'll explain why. So here's our next histogram, and as you can clearly see, this histogram does not fit the description of the perfect histogram because all the peaking, all the data is over to the left, and that means we've captured lots of shadow or dark detail in the image. There's a little bit, I guess, of midtones, but generally no highlights. Well, if we now take a look at the image, we see why. This is a shot at night time. I took this a couple of years ago in Paris. It was in the evening, and of course there's not going to be any highlights because the sun is not up. There's nothing that is particularly bright. Okay, there's some street lights, the lights on the Eiffel Tower are going to be bright, but generally speaking this image is mostly made up of darker tones. So let's bring the histogram back up. The great thing about this histogram is it shows us that I've successfully captured all the shadow detail, all the dark tones, but I'm not clipping, I'm not hitting the left hand side of the graph. So that means I've got nothing that is absolutely black and I've got nothing that is absolutely white. So although the histogram is not in the middle, it's shifted over to the left. That's okay, because again, the histogram represents the tones that you've captured. Let's take a look at another image. Now looking at this histogram, this is the complete opposite of the one we looked at previously where most of the data was over to the left. Clearly with this histogram, the data is over to the right. There's a bit of shadow detail here. Here we have some midtones, but here is where most of the data is. So this is an image which technically is overexposed. Let's take a look at the image. This image I shot a few days ago on the Gold Coast. Beautiful day, close to sundown, so I'm actually shooting towards the sun. The sun is about to go down and I actually quite like it. The overexposed area of course is here where the sun is reflecting off the sea. Here's where our shadow detail is, and again it's open to individual interpretation if you like. Some people would not like this image, but I actually quite like it. So again, the histogram is a representation of the tones you've captured. Here's the guy with the surfboard. Here's let's go back. This is the midtones here is probably going to be the mountains in the background here, and maybe these rocks, but clearly the highlights and this massive peak here is going to be this overexposed area. Again, it's open to individual interpretation. I quite like the image, so although this doesn't fit the bill of the perfect histogram, again with me, that's okay. Now, when it comes to histograms, there is no right or wrong. It's entirely up to you how you interpret your image, because photography is an art form. So if you're purposely choosing to underexpose your image, your histogram will reflect that, and most of the data will be over to the left-hand side of the graph. If you're purposely overexposing your image for effect maybe, and again, that's perfectly fine, it's your choice, then of course when you look at the histogram, most of the data is going to be over to the right. Generally speaking though, where possible, we do want to avoid clipping the shadows or the highlights. So ideally we don't want any peeking over to the far right or the far left. You may have heard a term called blown out. Sometimes people say, oh, you've blown out the highlights, your sky is blown out. That means that you have pushed the exposure to the extent where the sky, the bright parts of your image are so overexposed that you can't recover the detail, even if you're editing maybe a raw image. So you need to watch out for that one. But again, no rules. The histogram is a visual representation of the tonal range of your image based on what you've chosen and how you've chosen to capture your image. So exposing to the right is a popular technique often used by photographers as a way of giving you a better tonal range and less digital noise in your images. And it simply means that you look at your histogram prior to taking the picture, and then what you do is you push it a bit more to the right where the highlights are. Then you take your image, put it into software like Lightroom for example, and pull everything back again. This is a very popular technique and it's pretty straightforward and easy to do. So earlier on today I took an image with a Canon 80D. If you look at the histogram, there's a lot of peeking over to the left, so there's a lot of underexposed areas in this image. There's picture number 1. Now for picture number 2, I wanted to try out the exposing to the right technique, so all I've done is I've adjusted the exposure compensation on the camera, and watch as the histogram starts to shift over to the right. Now there's a lot of peak in there. I don't want this to peak, I don't want to clip my highlights, so I'm just going to bring this back a little bit, and here's picture number 2. Okay, so I've now opened up the image in Lightroom, and remember this image was taken using this technique exposing to the right, which means it's slightly overexposed because we're pushing the highlights. And if we look at the histogram, we can see that there's a lot of detail over to the right where the highlights are. Equally, there is a lot of shadow detail and there's not a lot of midtones going on. So we're going to fix this. So first thing we're going to do is just bring the exposure down a touch. Then I'm going to go to the highlights, which will affect the highlights. I'm going to bring the highlights down and you'll see how this starts to recover the detail in the sky. I'm then going to go to the shadow slider, and of course I don't want to reduce the shadows and make it even darker. I want to increase the shadows to bring the detail out in the shadows. Okay, looks pretty cool. Look how it's changed the look of the histogram. It's completely changed it. Going to just increase the exposure a touch now. That looks really cool. Now contrast, just going to increase the contrast a touch. Okay, and for now I'm going to leave it at that. I mean, this is not a finished edit by any means, but if we look at the before and the after, this shows you how easy it is to edit an image in Lightroom, especially when you're using the exposing to the right technique and of course the histogram. Now, popular with landscape photographers is the live histogram, and this means that you can see your histogram actually whilst you're composing and putting your image together. And this is great because you can then see how your image is going to come out before you actually press the shutter button. This is a feature found in all of the mirrorless cameras, but also you can use this in some DSLR cameras as long as you're shooting in the live view mode. And to show you this working, I'm using the live view function on my Nikon camera, and as I wave it around and move it from bright sky to dark shadows, you can clearly see the histogram adjusting in real time based on the tones that it sees at that moment. So I hope you've enjoyed this video and you now know a bit more about histograms and how you can use them to better your photography. I'd like to say a big thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video and for supporting my channel. If you've enjoyed the video, please give us a thumbs up, it really helps. Consider subscribing to the channel if you're not already subscribed. New videos every single week. Down below you can leave comments, suggestions and questions. Hope to see you again sometime soon. See ya. Bye.